Okay. Today is Tuesday, June 26, 2018. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And as you can see, I'm here with Alderman Edward M. Burke. Good afternoon, Alderman.
Good afternoon.
It's great to be here today with you. And as you know, the subject for today is going to be a little bit more focused than I usually do. It's going to be about your involvement in the 1968 Democratic Convention as a Chicago police officer. And as I usually like to do, I wanted to get a little bit of background information from you, and then we'll spend the great bulk of the time talking about the convention itself. But let's start with when and where you were born.
I was born in Chicago on December 29th, 1943.
And 1943, war years. Was your father in the military?
He was not.
Okay. So what was he doing at the time?
He was a Cook County Deputy Sheriff.
And I know he got into politics later on in his life. When did that happen?
He was elected to the City Council in 1953 to succeed Clarence Wagner, who was the alderman and the Democratic committeeman of the 14th Ward, when Alderman Wagner was killed in a tragic automobile accident in International Falls, Minnesota.
Where is the 14th Ward? At least where was it at that time?
At that time, it was centered around the back of the yards neighborhood, St. John the Baptist Parish, Visitation Parish, ran basically from Garfield Boulevard on the south to 43rd Street on the north, which is the Canaryville neighborhood. The eastern boundary was Wells Street, and the western boundary was roughly Ashland Avenue.
You've got that down, but I'm sure the ward's boundaries have changed over the years.
They've changed dramatically over the years, yes.
Okay. And your mother, what was her name?
My mother's name was Ann Dolan, D-O-L-A-N, and they were married in St. John the Baptist Church in 1941.
Dolan certainly sounds Irish. Burke as well?
Correct.
So are you 100% Irish?
My grandparents all were born in Ireland and immigrated to the United States around the last part of the 19th century.
Your family religious when you were growing up?
Very religious. Our life was really, in those days, centered around the parish, Visitation Parish being the Catholic community to which we were linked. I was educated by Cincinnati Dominican nuns. Believe it or not, Mark, there were 78 nuns in our parish, where they taught in both the grammar school and the high school. And just as a bit of historical trivia, you might be interested in learning that Vice President Pence's mother was a student at Visitation High School and was taught by the Cincinnati Dominican nuns.
Really? And I understand that the Dailies sent their kids there as well?
No, the Daily boys, the older ones, went to De La Salle. The Daily girls, the oldest one went to Mercy High School. The others, I don't recall where they went. And then the younger Daily boys went to St. Ignatius.
Okay. Have any brothers and sisters?
I have two. I had two brothers. My one brother Joe is deceased, and my brother Dan is still alive.
Where did you go to college?
I went to high school at Quigley Preparatory Seminary, located in Chicago, and then I did my undergraduate work at DePaul University, and my advanced law school work at DePaul College of Law.
Quigley Preparatory Seminary. Does that mean you were flirting with the notion of being a priest at one time?
I was until in fourth year at Quigley. Father Jakubowski, who later became a bishop, told me to pick a different career.
Well, there must be a colorful story to go along with that.
No individual story, but much later, as I used to bump into Bishop Jakubowski, I would always tell him how I appreciated his good advice back in 1950. Well, actually, it was 1961 by that point.
That's when you graduated from high school?
Correct.
And graduated from DePaul then in 65?
I did.
What was your major while you were there?
I was a sociology major.
What did you think you wanted to do with your life at that point in time?
I think I wanted to be a lawyer, and of course after college I did go to law school, but at the same time I also went on the police department.
Which one came first?
I started at the police academy and law school at night in 1965.
Okay,
I was appointed to the police department February 15th, 1965, and would have begun law school in January of 1965 at night.
How would you describe the police academy experience? Was that a few months long, and how tough was that?
It was situated in a Civil War school building or hospital building at 708 O'Brien Street at the corner of Union Avenue and O'Brien Street in the old Maxwell Street neighborhood. Obviously it was at that point a remnant of the Civil War and rather a decrepit place. But it was especially difficult to balance both my police academy training and law school at night.
You think the police academy did a good job in preparing you to be an officer on the beat?
I think that the police academy and the instructors that were assigned there in those days did a very good job, yes.
When you're going to the police academy and in law school as well, this is the early days, well, maybe not even early days of the civil rights movement, and there was more possibly thought that there'd be things like riot control and those kind of issues that you'd have to deal with. Did you get some training at the police academy or subsequent training in dealing with large crowds?
Both at the police academy and during in-service academy, where we were given that kind of tactical training at the Armory, which was located just east of Michigan Avenue and Chicago Avenue.
Why did you decide to join the police force?
I was interested in law enforcement, and I thought it would be a good career choice. I don't know that at that time I perceived myself as a person that would stay on the police department. I think I was focusing on being a lawyer, but certainly being a police officer was great training and experience to become a lawyer.
Was it going to help pay for the law school?
I think when we began on the police department in 1965, the salary was $5,640 a year. By the time I left the police department, the salary had gone up to about $9,800 a year. Mayor Daley gave the cops a series of raises to bring them along during the middle and late 60s.
Yeah, I know that especially early in the Daley administration, he was taking actions that were really improving and professionalizing the police force. Would that be correct?
I think that the key to that professionalizing and improving training occurred in 1960 when Orlando Wilson became the superintendent of police, and it changed the whole outlook on law enforcement in Chicago.
What did your dad think about you being a police officer?
I took the test for the police department and I scored pretty high. And so I said to him, I'm going to go on the police department. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, well, why? I took the test and I'll be called in a matter of weeks. He said, because I want you to be a lawyer. I said, I haven't taken the law school admission test. He said, let me worry about that. Next thing I knew, I'm in the dean's office at DePaul University signing some papers and going to law school at night.
So it was because of your dad that you got to do both at the same time then?
It was good advice. I don't know that I thought it was good advice at the time, but it certainly turned out that way.
When you graduated from the police academy, then what was your first job, your first assignment with the police force?
I was here in the 1st District, the downtown area. The 1st District station was located at 11th and State. And my initial assignment was walking a beat on Clark Street from Michigan. No, it was Van Buren from Clark Street to Michigan.
Truly walking the beat? No patrol car?
No, no car. You have to understand how police work in Chicago was structured, and there were an awful lot of walking, we call them walking posts. And remember, at that point, we had no radios. You know, you assume, looking at a cop anywhere today, they've got a radio pinned to their jacket or shirt. We didn't have radios. If you were in a police car, there was a radio. Otherwise, if you were out of a police car, you had to make a pull, what we called, on a police call box that was located every few blocks. In fact, when you got to be a policeman, one of the pieces of equipment that you got was the brass key that allowed you to open the call box and call the station.
So when you're walking the neighborhoods, you're walking by yourself?
You're walking by yourself.
Do they still do that today, Mr. Alderman?
There's very few walking beats. Almost all police work, not only here but across the country, is motorized or mobilized, because now there's actually a return to the use of bicycles in police work.
And I know a few cities even use mounted patrols.
Actually, at the time that I came on the police department, the mounted unit had been disbanded. It had gone from a very large police presence to being no police presence. And actually, I can be credited with fighting for the return of the mounted unit when I was later in the city council.
Well, that gets us up to 1968, and the reason that you and I are sitting here. You've got your book in front of you. Why don't you talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll get into the events of the convention.
Back around the time that Chicago was preparing to host the 1996 convention, I was at a DePaul University event with Craig Sauter, and we started talking about the rich history of Chicago's role in presidential conventions. Craig at the time was a professor at DePaul, And we found it rather ironic that back in 1968, I was on one side of the police lines and he was on the other as a protester. And so we started talking further and said, wouldn't it be an interesting idea that two people that were on opposite sides of that question might collaborate on a historical analysis of Chicago's role in presidential conventions. And we decided to do it.
Would you, off the top of your head, know how many conventions Chicago has hosted over the decades?
More than any other place in the nation. And it's also interesting to note that most Americans would be surprised to know that there's nothing in our Constitution or in our nation's laws that provide for a nominating convention. It is simply a custom that has grown up over the years since Chicago hosted that 1860 convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And by the way, a convention that was rigged by Chicago politicians. Otherwise, Abraham Lincoln never would have been president.
So sometimes it works to the nation's benefit.
I think that one could make out an argument to that extent.
You mentioned before we got started how important 1968 was to our nation's history. I have one other incident in 1968 I wanted to ask you about, because I would think as a police officer you would have had a big role to play when this happened, and that's obviously the riots that occurred after Martin Luther King's assassination, which I believe was April 4th. What were you doing after that?
I, along with the entire Chicago Police Department, was mobilized in 12-hour shifts. The whole west side of the city was on fire. There was anarchy, mass looting, violence, arson. And the police department really was not prepared for what took place. The city wasn't prepared for what took place. But then again, cities around the nation were unprepared for this kind of rioting, which probably was unprecedented going back to the time of the Civil War, when there were draft riots in New York.
But it got the city, I'm sure, thinking about the implications of August of that same year. And it sounds like the police force did an awful lot of planning leading up to the Democratic Convention. Would that be accurate?
I think it's correct to say that, yes.
Okay. What was your specific assignment then at the Democratic Convention?
I was assigned to the State's Attorney's Police, the State's Attorney being the office that is responsible for prosecution of criminal matters in each of the counties of Illinois. And at that time, we had a force of about 100 officers.
Does that mean you were not formally part of the Chicago Police Force?
We were all Chicago police officers assigned to the state's attorney.
Now, obviously I read the chapter on 1968 convention. Would you know off the top of your head how much of a police presence there was in the city at that time?
At that time, the police department would have been about 14,000.
Yeah, the numbers that were quoted in that chapter: 11,900 Chicago police, 300 Cook County police, 7,500 Illinois National Guard, 7,500 federal troops, and 1,000 FBI. So that's a substantial presence in the city at that time.
But keep in mind, they were on 12-hour shifts, no days off. And so that would have expanded their presence. You'd also have to include suburban departments that were mobilized, because there was a lot of movement from O'Hare Field to the downtown area, VIPs, high-ranking government officials that would have been in Chicago for the convention. So there was a lot of police presence.
What was your shift? What were the hours?
I was working 8 to 8.
8 a.m. to 8 p.m.?
Correct.
Okay. And where was your beat?
I was assigned to the International Amphitheater where the convention itself took place.
Were you in uniform?
No, I was in plain clothes.
What was it that you were supposed to be doing when you were working your shift?
Well, we were assigned to the floor and to the galleries of the International Amphitheater to be available in a more understated presence, rather than have a uniform with a nightstick and that sort of thing. They were down more on the street. We were in the convention hall itself.
Most of the police presence in the amphitheater then were in plain clothes?
Correct.
Were you armed otherwise?
Oh, yeah. But I shouldn't say that, not entirely, because one of the interesting encounters took place between a uniformed commanding officer and one of the journalists who was arrested.
Is that the Dan Rather incident?
Yes.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about that incident?
Well, Rather was a rather brusque and loud person. He got very confrontational with the then commander of the 1st District, Paul McLaughlin, who also had been detailed to the interior of the International Amphitheater. And in this encounter, he started raising his voice and yelling at the police commander. The commander told him to contain himself, and he shoved the commander. It's not a good idea to shove a Chicago police commander, whereupon Paul McLaughlin locked him up, put the cuffs on him, and took him back to a holding area where the police had established a headquarters in a trailer outside the amphitheater itself.
Some of the reports I heard said that he was punched in the gut.
That Rather was punched in the gut?
Yeah, I thought I'd read that someplace.
There was a lot written about the convention that was not completely correct. And I would say whoever wrote that or said that was misinformed.
You're talking about one of the United States premier journalists at the time, and he was, I think he was one of the people who was saying that, obviously.
He might have, and it might have been Mike Wallace. It might have been the other journalist, Walter Cronkite, who was up in the press box. But it did not happen.
Was Mayor Daley close to that incident?
No, he was over in the Illinois delegation when that happened. But he then did get up from his seat at the Illinois delegation and go to the police trailer behind the amphitheater, where some of the executives from the broadcast media had gathered, and they were decrying this police violence, and they shut up pretty quickly when Daley walked in.
Were you present when that happened?
I was.
Did you have any direct dealings with the mayor?
When it happened, I went over to the Illinois delegation and I said, Mayor, I think you should know that Paul McLaughlin just locked up Dan Rather, and they've got him over in the police headquarters trailer. So he got up out of his chair, and underneath the stage there was a door that you could go through, and underneath the stage, and walk out to the area behind the amphitheater where the trailer was located. He walked into the trailer and settled the matter very quickly. In other words, Rather was about to be transported to the lockup at 35th and Emerald. And Daley told his executives, in other words, Rather's executives, you tell Rather, apologize to Commander McLaughlin, and we'll settle this right here.
Did Rather apologize?
Yes, he did.
And then he was released?
He was.
Do you remember the expression on Mayor Daley's face when you told him that information about Dan Rather?
Well, he was he was awash in reports coming to him, not only of delegates and observers who were in the amphitheater itself, but what was happening in the parks and on the streets, especially outside the Hilton Hotel. You might be interested also to remember that there was a telephone strike going on, and it was long before the ubiquitous presence of mobile phones, which we now take for granted. They're everywhere. One of the few people who had a mobile phone at that point was Mayor Daley, and it was in a big suitcase that you had to carry around, and I assume because it had big batteries and whatever. So he was one of the few people that had mobile phone access.
It's almost as if the cards were stacked against Chicago, because that wasn't the only strike that was going on in the city, was it?
No.
I know there was a taxi strike. There was a couple others, I believe, as well.
I don't know that anything other than the telephone strike really had an effect or got well organized.
Mr. Alderman, I wonder if you can paint a picture for us of, I've got this image of what the amphitheater must look like. It's the old Stockyard Amphitheater.
Correct.
How would you describe what was going on during the convention itself? How would you describe that building, that room?
But you got to remember that it wasn't just the rodeo that took place there. That's where the wrestling matches took place. I was an anti-Frame usher in my teenage years, and I think I saw more performances of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circuses and wrestling matches with Gorgeous George. I don't know if you're old enough to remember.
I remember Gorgeous
George. And the old ladies that would go to those wrestling matches and scream, they really thought it was on the square. And there were concerts. I think at one point the Beatles performed there. So it was not like horse manure all over the place. It was a arena with a lot of seating all around the center part, where at this event the delegations were located.
I assume that the delegations were all on the floor itself, and that the spectators were up in the bleachers in the gallery?
I would say virtually all of the delegations were on the floor. Now, there may have been one or two that had to be accommodated in an area immediately adjacent to the floor. But I would say, generally speaking, that's where they were at.
Now, we're used to watching conventions today, and they're all very staged, and they're all very predictable. You know, by the time you get to the convention, everybody knows who the candidate's going to be.
And there's not much mystery.
But that wasn't the case in '68, was it?
It wasn't.
Do you remember much of, I think it was Wednesday night, that would have been the third night. I believe they were talking about the platform, but maybe also introducing some of the candidates. But it was the platform discussion I thought was most interesting, because you get into the issue of the Vietnam War, and it sounds like that was a very, very contentious piece.
There's a very interesting book that just has come out. I think the author's name is O'Donnell. Anyway, it's about politics of 1968 and everything that took place. I've suggested over the years that one might compare what happened in Chicago to a tea kettle, and just as a tea kettle that's boiling needs to emit steam, so too did society in America in 1968, and it just happened to be here in Chicago that release valve took place. It's also true, is it not, that no one was killed in Chicago, but at the Republican convention in Miami, 3 people were killed.
I didn't know the second part of that. You were a law student. Obviously, you were interested in politics at the time. You're also a police officer on the convention floor. Were you able to pay attention to the nature of the debates, or was that really not a possibility with what you're supposed to do?
That really wasn't something that I was there to think about. I was there in a law enforcement role.
Do you recall the incident that happened, I believe it was the following night? Senator Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut nominates George McGovern for president, and as I understand, the Illinois delegation was sitting right in front of the platform.
That's correct.
And here's what Ribicoff said. Now, this is the night where there's some serious rioting going outside the streets.
And I might refer you to that book I just mentioned, because there's a photograph in there of that event with Richard J. Daley, his son Bill Daley, who would go on, of course, to be Secretary of Commerce and Chief of Staff in the Obama White House. John Daley, who today serves as a member of the county board, the then president of the Cook County Board, George Dunn, the then governor, Sam Shapiro, and other figures seated around Richard J. Daley. And up in the upper left-hand corner, you'd see me.
A young man. You suit and tie?
Suit and tie and dark glasses.
Sunglasses?
Not sunglasses, but glasses with dark frames.
Okay. Well, here's the comment. This is one of those important quotes of American history that Ribicoff makes, and he's nominating George McGovern for president, who I guess wasn't in any of the primaries, but it was a different kind of a year that year. Here's the comment. With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. Do you remember what Daley's reaction was after that?
I do. He was outraged. And you'll see in that photograph him shouting at Ribicoff, his son Richard M. Daley with his hands cupped around his mouth, shouting at Ribicoff. Billy Daley shouting at Ribicoff. It's quite dramatic.
Do you know what they were shouting?
Well, I know what people have said that they were shouting, or that Richard J. Daley was shouting, And as a eyewitness to that event, I can tell you that what people have said Richard J. Daley shouted is absolutely untrue.
What's in your book was, "Go home, go home." Are some of the other people suggesting he used some expletives in there as well?
Obscene expletives. And I think Daley was especially aggravated because Ribicoff had come in to his office immediately prior to this, or the day before, seeking political support from Richard J. Daley, who could arguably be identified as one of the most important Democratic kingmakers in the nation.
Yeah, he'd had that reputation for several convention cycles, ever since 1960, really.
Well, rightly or wrongly, he was identified by some pundits as being responsible for the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960.
Mr. Altman, do you have a view on that subject?
I think Daley did a great deal to support and get out the vote for John F. Kennedy in 1960. Put the full weight of the Democratic Cook County organization behind John F. Kennedy, but analyses in later years, I think, have disputed that the Cook County organization tipped the scale in favor of the first Catholic to be elected.
Well, allegations of stuff in the ballot box. Now, obviously, you weren't there in 1960, but what's your assessment of that allegation?
Well, they accused Daley of voting people in the cemeteries, of stuffing the ballot boxes, of doing all sorts of things. But you have to remember that there was a very vigorous Republican organization all through Illinois at that time. And politics was practiced in a far different way by both sides. So some might argue that Daley might just have been defending the integrity of his side of the political dispute.
Well, let's bring it back to first-person account of 1968, where you were there present. But you're inside the convention hall. And, you know, most Americans, what they know and remember today are the images that were going on outside the convention hall. So I wanted to spend a few moments talking about that as well. And let's start with this question. The mayor decided early on to be very difficult when it came to issuing permits for marches. Do you think he made the right choice in that regard, of not issuing a lot of these permits that were requested?
I think attitudes about policing today have changed a great deal, and the experts today who try to control large numbers of people and keep those large numbers from becoming violent or getting out of control, err on the side of leaving people do a lot more than they were permitted to do in 1968.
And here's what Daley is quoted as saying: "No one is going to take over the streets of Chicago." Is that pretty accurate assessment of how he felt at the time?
I think that is a very accurate assessment of how he felt. And you have to remember, looking back to the hippies and the yippies and the other groups that flooded into Chicago. Remember the Chicago Seven, Dellinger and Hayden and all those folks. They were threatening to poison the water source. they were asserting all manner and form of crazy activities. They brought a pig to the Civic Center. That was before it was named the Daly Center. And we're talking about nominating the pig for president. It was madness. But a lot of people believed some of those things. And you had cops that were working 12-hour shifts, no days off, no radios, stuck in these big police vans with no air conditioning and whatever. The conditions couldn't have been more conducive to uncomfortable work conditions.
I wonder, Mr. Alderman, if I can have you turn to that green tab on the top there. Turn to that page. If I can ask you to read something.
There's a red tab here. Is that the one?
On the top of the book, there's a green tab.
Oh, okay. I would call it blue, but you can call it green.
Okay. And then there's a portion that's highlighted underneath, right underneath where that green tab is.
Okay.
And if I could ask you to read what's highlighted there, because I think you guys did a great job of explaining what was being brought, what was coming to Chicago at that time.
It would be better if I had my reading glasses, but as August waned, thousands of students and activists were drawn almost irresistibly to Chicago, urged on by anti-war groups including, well, this is what I was just saying, SDS, XCB, and the Yippies, to demand that the Democrats nominate a peace candidate and adopt a peace platform. In contrast with the Democrats' Festival of Death, the Yippies staged their own Festival of Life, an anarchist masquerade of unrestrained rebellion featuring nude swimming in the lake, pot smoking in the parks, music in the air. Teenage boys and girls, older graduate students and professors, housewives and Vietnam veterans, musicians and artists, conscientious objectors and professional agitators, theater companies, and thousands of other young people came in cars or motorcades and by trains, sometimes hitching or walking for miles to participate in a political carnival that sought to mock legitimacy and legacy of Mayor Daley and Hubert Humphrey.
I thought when I read that passage, that really paints a picture of what it must have been like, the kinds of people who were coming to Chicago. Most of them, many of them, very innocent intentions, but do you have any doubt in your mind that some of them were coming there to incite the very kind of thing that blew up in everybody's face on August 28th?
Well, let's look at the facts and look at what happened at the General Logan statue immediately across from the Conrad Hilton Hotel, where some protesters had been lodged and had rooms, where they were throwing, back in the day when a lot of people smoked, there were big heavy glass ashtrays. They were hurling those out the window at the police. When you have a missile like that that weighs a couple of pounds and it's being hurled from the 12th floor of a building, that is a deadly missile. On the other hand, you had other of these protesters using plastic bags which they had filled with feces and urine that they were being hurled at the police. There were police officers injured. This was a riotous confrontation that was not the fault of the police. The police, as the old Mayor Daley, who was at times prone to malapropisms, said in one of his interviews, the police are there to are not there to create the disorder. They're there to preserve the disorder. And his press spokesman said to the journalist, "Don't print what he says. Print what he means."
Nobody printed what he meant. They printed what he said.
Right.
Now, you weren't observing all this, but I know that especially on August 28th, and this is a long night, you might have been off of duty when a lot of this stuff was going on, because I know they went way beyond midnight on most of these nights, and the discussions, it sounds like you were already gone, but I understand that people were able to watch the news feeds in the convention floor so they could see the rioting that was going on outside while they were on the convention floor. Is that right?
Yeah, but you didn't have that ever-present TV ability to watch in-time activities like you do today. That was 50 years ago.
Ribicoff's comments were because they're seeing some of these activities and they're seeing police officers with their batons out and going after the protesters.
I think that might have been filmed. I don't think it was live.
And that's what I understand, because of the communications strike, that they had to kind of bring that film back to the convention hall and then show it there. So after the fact. What did you do after?
And it might have even been the night before in Lincoln Park.
What did you do after your shift was over at 8 p.m.?
Went and got a couple of cold beers.
Where were you going to get a couple cold beers?
Home, get some rest.
Now, you'd mentioned before that you also went to a couple bars that the police oftentimes frequented.
Well, I might have on the way.
What were your fellow police officers telling you? The ones who were on the street, what were they talking about?
They were actually rather proud in many instances of the tactics that we had been taught. Like, for instance, the mob that was in Grant Park, thousands of protesters. And specifically the tactical team from the old 12th District formed up, just 12 of them, with their lieutenant in a V formation and moved into that crowd, and believe it or not, actually moved them out of the park. Nobody thought that 12 people could move 1,000 protesters, but it worked.
Did any of them talk about seeing things like, you mentioned Logan's statue? It's a gorgeous, it's a prominent statue towards the southern end of Grant Park that a lot of the protesters climbed on and actually put up Viet Cong flags and things like that.
That's correct.
Did they tell you about those kinds of things?
Oh, yeah. And Logan is an interesting Illinois figure, a hero of the Civil War, and the person that created Memorial Day. It was originally called Decoration Day, and became the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the Union Veterans Organization.
What was the feeling among the police officers, or you knew then, of seeing incidents where the protesters obviously disrespecting the American flag, they're putting up the Viet Cong flag? What would their visceral reaction to things like that be?
Getting ashtrays hurled at them from the 12th floor of a hotel building, getting feces and urine thrown on them. Those are rather difficult things to contend with. But by and large, let me repeat once again, nobody was seriously hurt. Nobody was killed, like 3 of them were killed in Miami. So I think that the Chicago police, by and large, did a pretty good job of handling those responsibilities.
I've read lots of it, of incidents that when the police went into the crowd, oftentimes innocent bystanders were caught up in that. Oftentimes reporters, journalists were caught up in that as well. And some of this stuff is based on what was going on in the convention floor as well. But Chet Huntley. The news profession in this city is now under assault by the Chicago police. And Walter Cronkite, a name you mentioned before, referred to the police as thugs.
And he also backed down when he did an interview with Richard J. Daley. And Daley told him, Walter, you're a guest in our home, and we respect you and your reputation. But we have people telling us here that they're going to poison our water supply. I have a responsibility as the mayor of Chicago to ensure the safety and the ability of Chicagoans to go about their daily tasks. I'm not using those words as a direct quote, but that was the tenor of the interaction between Daley and Cronkite backed down.
Here's a question for you, Mr. Alderman. You don't have to answer, but I wonder where your sympathies were that year for president. Who was your favorite candidate?
I think until he was murdered in Los Angeles, probably it would have been Bobby Kennedy.
And that happened right after the California primary in June, early June.
And his last words were, on to Chicago. Or last recorded words.
Now, the outgrowth of the Chicago Democratic Convention in '68 was that you could make a good point that a big chunk of the younger generation was mobilized and radicalized might be too strong a word, but moved in sympathy from what they're seeing. But overall, the American public generally did not like what they saw and generally supported what Mayor Daley and the Chicago police were doing.
And keep in mind that Mayor Daley was reelected up until the time of his sudden demise in 1976. And I think it could be argued that after '68, nobody could beat Richard J. Daley in Chicago.
Do you think the convention, the way it played out on TV, played into the hands of Richard Nixon?
Some observers think that had there been a couple more weeks, that Humphrey might have been able to pull it out.
It was a rare year in American politics. It wasn't just a two-man race. George Wallace was in the race as well that year.
That's correct.
And
you had Bobby Kennedy killed. You had Martin Luther King assassinated. You had all of these events.
Of course, the year started with the Tet Offensive. There was the Pueblo incident early in the year. Just before the convention, I believe, the Soviets occupied Czechoslovakia. It was quite a year.
It sure was.
I want to read you a quote from the Walker Report. The nature of the police response, and the Walker Report was the official report that was done, Walker after Dan Walker, who eventually became governor of the state of Illinois.
And eventually go to jail.
He would say, had nothing to do with what I did as governor. So that was what he always told me, at least. The nature of the police response was unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence on many occasions, particularly that night, 28th in particular. That violence was made all the more shocking by the fact that it was often inflicted upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no orders, made no threat. These included peaceful demonstrators, onlookers, and a large number of residents who were simply passing through or happened to live in the areas that were confrontations were occurring. And I'm sure you've heard this many times. The ultimate assessment of the Walker Report was to call this a police riot.
Which many people have disputed for many years. And Dan Walker, of course, who I considered to be a friend, is entitled to his opinion, but so are the other citizens of Chicago who did not believe that what those protesters and the mobs of people that came to Chicago did was proper.
Are you one of the people who would disagree with the Walker Report?
I would say that it was not a police riot. There certainly would have been examples of officers who became overly aggressive, but it's also true that by and large the vast majority of Chicago police officers did the best they could under very difficult circumstances.
The other thing that came on the heels of the convention itself and the rioting, of course, was the trial for what started off to be the Chicago 8 that became the Chicago 7. Bobby Seale was removed from the major part of the trial. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that one of the indictments, the charges in the indictment for all of these was crossing state boundaries to incite a riot. Do you believe that was an accurate portrayal of what the Chicago 7 were doing?
I think that it is an accurate portrayal, and I believe that a lot of people were manipulated by some of these characters who sought to take advantage of that situation.
Okay, just a couple more questions for you here. Are you proud of your service as a Chicago police officer?
I am.
Unequivocally?
Unequivocally, I think the men and women of law enforcement in Chicago represented one of the finest police departments in America. Many of the women and men that I was privileged to serve with went on to other careers. Many became lawyers, judges, doctors, business people, and to a person they have always looked back on their time in the Chicago Police Department with great fondness.
Do you think Mayor Daley, would you have any criticisms about his decisions during that time?
I think if his decisions would be made today under the standards that we accept for crowd control and suppression of civil unrest, that things probably would have been differently, but it's also impossible to measure 50 years later what he did then without knowing what he would 50 years into the future.
Does it seem possible that we're 50 years removed from those events?
Hard to understand how a half a century has slipped by us.
Are you proud of your city if you're looking at that time frame?
I think America then was undergoing a struggle with its own national identity that probably was unprecedented since the time of the Civil War. I think Chicago is the most American of American cities. It is now and was then. And I think most Chicagoans feel that same way.
It just so happened that that summer, some hot, sultry days at the end of August, the whole world was watching Chicago, wasn't it?
I think you could certainly say that with confidence.
Any final comments for you then?
We were happy to be able to document the events of 1968 in this book, Inside the Wigwam. And if one would look back to the convention of 1864 that took place here in Chicago, one would be surprised, I believe, to see how similar the two events were, with rumors of a plot to break out Confederate prisoners from Camp Douglas, with fistfights on the floor of the convention, with plots circulating and fears sweeping through the populace. We were quite impressed to see those similarities when we did the research.
Any more tumultuous year, though, than convention, I should say, than 1968's convention?
I'd like to think that the 44 convention was tumultuous, which saw a sitting vice president tossed out and replaced by Harry Truman, which saw a fire chief in Chicago shut down the convention in order to permit Harry Truman to be nominated. And I've often thought, looking back at that event, what would the history of our nation have been if Henry Wallace were the vice president when FDR took his last breath in Warm Springs, Georgia? Would he have ordered the dropping of the atomic bomb? Would he have nationalized the railroads? What would his attitude have been at Potsdam with Stalin? The ifs and buts of history are always fodder for speculation.
And there were plenty of ifs and buts in 1968.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Alderman Burke. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hear firsthand about the 68 convention.
Well, you're kind to solicit my opinions, reminiscences, memories, and it's always good to share those with people who may benefit from what my experience has been.
Thank you.
You're welcome.